Hello, this is Minder Chen. I'm professor of Management Information System at Smith School of Business Economics at CSU Channel Island. In this lecture, we're going to discuss organizational structure. And under the POLC framework, organizational structure is under the organizing category. It is about how we design the structure of a business in order to carry out the vision, mission, and strategy that we have defined. The learning objectives include the following: define organizational structure and its basic elements, and try to describe different type of organizational structures. First, let's get a kind of high-level picture of where the organizational structures stand in the context of the overall key elements within a firms. This is actually a famous McKinsey 7S framework. McKinsey is a high-end business consulting firms. You can find out information about this framework. When you go to that page, click on View Interactive, which is a button, and there was some voice annotated explanation of each of the components. So I'm not going to go through this framework in any detail. I will refer you to this online resources. In Wikipedia, there's also an entry for the 7S framework. It's pretty well known, it's pretty traditional. And let me just point out a few things. And certainly we have discussed strategy, so it's nothing new to us. Share value, we kind of touch base on value in the context of vision and mission, and it's the core value that everybody in your organization share. The style is really related to organizational culture, which we'll discuss much later on. Staffing certainly is related to HR. System is about how work gets done. It's closely related to the internal business processes. Structured is really organizational structures. That's the main topic for this lecture. And the skill is the talent and skill set that's needed by the people that you hire in order to carry out variety of things and initiative within your firm. So structure is really part of this 7S framework, which not only can be used kind of describe the organization's key element, but also can be used to evaluate, assess an organizational situation in order for a consultant to make suggestion for changes. So what is organizational structure? Organizational structure refers to how individual or team work within the organization and how their jobs being divided up and how they should coordinate the works they've been working on. And in order to achieve organizational goals and objectives, the individual work need to be coordinated and managed. So we need to put in a structure such that this coordination and management can be done. Structure is a useful tool for us to help us to define how those things should be coordinated. And it specify, the organizational structure specify the following component. One is the reporting relationships. Who do you report to? Who report to whom? And so you know who is your boss or who are your bosses, and it could happen, and also who may report it to you. And eventually this reporting relationship forms some kind of hierarchy. We call it organizational chart. And it also specified the formal communication channels, like how message will get out from the top or from the bottom to the top. And certainly they are so-called informal communication channel. Rumors, etc., are considered informal. But the organizational structure tried to define the formal communication channel. It also describes how separate action or work of individual are linked together. This is related to the coordination. Part of the function of the organizational structure is to coordinate individual work. So once again, organizational structure is how job tasks are formally divided, grouped, coordinated. It determines how work of individual team within the organization is coordinated. And this is the bottom line. This is how you set up your organization. For instance, if you're starting your a new company and you need to decide who you need to hire, what department you need to have, and what kind of job function each employees may need to perform in variety of roles. And that's really about the organizational structure. So once again, organizational structure determine who the boss is or who do you manage. This is going up, who is your boss, and who do you manage is going down. And eventually it defines your span of control, like how many people reporting to you, and potentially how many bosses that you may have. And you'll be surprised, sometimes you have more than one bosses. Or sometimes the boss's boss jump through multiple levels and come to give you instruction directly. And who work with whom, in this case, it's kind of who may be your colleague that you work within a team, a department, or sometimes cross-functional area. And we also need to define how broad or narrow the job tasks are. This is about specialization, which we'll discuss, and how much autonomy people may have to make decision. This is about centralization or decentralization related to decision making. And last, not the least, is how many rules the organization has. It's about the procedural policy, business rule, and if it's very detailed, then it's a very formal type of organizational structure. And to some extent, organizational structure can be mistakenly considered to be really just an org chart, organizational chart. But when you finish this unit, you will find out it's actually more than just the organizational chart. Organizational chart typically only describe the reporting relationships, like who is the boss and who do you manage. That's the question answered by the organizational chart, which we will certainly introduce. There's some key element, or sometimes we call it building blocks, which are dimensions on which the organizational structure can be defined. And we can also use it to differentiate one type of organizational structure from the other. These 5 key elements are the following: work specialization, how specialized the job tasks are; centralization or decentralization in terms of decision making; formalization in terms of policy rules that you may have; and the hierarchical level, or the span of control in terms of how many people one manager can possibly manage. And certainly different manager manage different number of subordinate, but roughly speaking, some organization has kind of a magic number in terms of the span of control, which we will discuss. The last is departmentalizations, how you group people or team into department. And there's two major ways to do so. So when we try to describe the structure of an organization, you will use this 5 dimensions to kind of get a sense of what kind of organization structure that is. So let's go over each of the elements in the following. Work specialization is the degree to which tasks within an organization are divided into separate jobs. And there's some advantage of highly specialized work. It can be very efficient. It increases employees' skill through repetition, which means you're doing something frequently, you become really good at it, hopefully. And there's less between jobs, switching different type of jobs for the employees that may increase the productivity. And also we can provide more specialized training. The training can be done in a shorter time span, so we can pretty much hire somebody to flip the hamburger in and out without a lot of time for the training. And also allow us to use more specialized equipment to be more efficient. So what does this remind you of? Probably you would think about Taylorisms in terms of specialization, and Fayol also mentions specializations or division of labor. So this is to some extent very traditional. However, as you should know by now, there's some disadvantage of highly specialized work. People may get bored because of doing just simple things repeatedly again and again. They easily get tired. It can be very stressful. And eventually there may be high turnover rate for employee. And when you have high turnover rate, you need to spend time and money in terms of recruiting and training those new recruits. So what's the solution to the disadvantages of high job specializations? I think we mentioned this previously: job rotation, job enrichment, which will rotate people from one job to the other, and also try to broaden the jobs by including additional tasks and responsibility. And the slide is a courtesy from Professor Dylan Cooper. So there's really no black and white in terms of whether job specializations is good or bad. As you can see by this curve, you will find out that you will gain some productivity when you try to have some degree of work specializations. However, you become more efficient. However, because of here they call it human diseconomy, people feel disconnected because they're doing something so specialized that it becomes very boring. And the productivity actually, after a certain point, tends to drop. What this diagram tells us is that there's always some kind of middle ground. In many management principle or theory, there's no black and white right or wrong. It's really just finding the right balance. In this case, some specialization certainly will be good, but too much of it, it will backfire. This applied to a lot of others principle that we have been talking about so far. Let's move on to the second element, which is centralization. It's about decision-making and the authority to make decisions, whether it's in the centralized unit or locations in organization, or has been decentralized to the local level. And if it's highly centralized, the top managers make most of the key decisions. If highly decentralized, lower-level manager or workers and groups will make most of the decision. And eventually, the so-called distributed fashion may be the best. Distributed, it's not the same as decentralized. It's really between centralized and decentralized, which means you would decide how to distribute the decision-making authority to the different level of the organization depends on the situation. Like if something needs a quicker response time, if something may not be so critical, which may not impact a lot of other functional area, then you may want to distribute that decision-making right to the more local level so they can respond to the local situation faster. So let's look at the advantage of centralizations, which is really efficient, focus, and also since it's centralized, any conflict arise, which can be resolved by the central unit. Decentralization also has some advantage, which allow people to be more creative because they're closer to the customer. They know the real pain of the customer and have a desire to solve it. And the decision can be made quicker, so you don't have to pass the problem, the buck to the top, and then the decision is coming down from them. That may take forever. Okay, customer doesn't want to hear like, oh, let me talk to my boss to make a decision. They want you as a frontline worker to make a decision right on the spot to the benefit of serving the customer better. And eventually when people are given the decision rights, they tend to be more satisfied with their job. Key element 3, formalization. Formalization extends to which organization's policy, procedure, job description, and rules are written and explicitly articulated. And so if you see an organization which has a thick rule book or policy book, then they're very formalized in this regard. In a lot of new startup, since they're new, they usually run in a very dynamic, informal fashion. That will be the other extreme. A highly formalized job gives the worker a minimum amount of discretion in terms of deciding how to deal with certain situations. And the greater standardization, the less input the employee may have to give for the organization in terms of how the job is done. For instance, McDonald's, how you make a hamburger has been pretty much determined by the headquarters. There's actually Hamburger University by McDonald's to train you how to make hamburger and how to manage different things in the restaurant. So that's a very formalized organizational structure. Less formalized job give the worker a large amount of discretion. So there is less standardization. The more the employee decide themselves how to do the job, and so they feel they have the responsibility, and they may actually do a better job and more engaged in their work. To some extent, a college professor belong to this category, because although we have some kind of curriculum standard, but a lot of time we give professor a lot of freedom to decide how to cover a course and how to choose which textbook to choose. So there's a lot of freedom here. So once again, there's a pro and con. We can kind of debate in terms of whether more formalized is better or less formalized is better. I'll give you an extreme. This is a less formal organization. Nordstrom is known for have very simple rule. And if you go to Nordstrom's website, you will find out that they specify their number one goal is to provide outstanding customer service, and they set both employees' personal and professional goals high, and they trust the employee. They have great confidence in employees' ability to achieve that. Therefore, as we know it, Nordstrom's rule number one is use best judgment in all situations. And you'll be surprised there will be no additional rule. That's only one rule. In case you have questions, they certainly encourage you to talk to the supervisor and the manager to address the question when situation arise. Key element 4 is hierarchical structures. Hierarchical structures usually are shown in organizational chart, which is determined by the span of control of manager. What do we mean by span of control? Span of control is the number of subordinate a manager direct or manage. And if assuming that all the manager manage the same number of subordinate, then we can actually use the total number of employee and eventually calculate the number of the hierarchical level of this organization. And we'll give you an example later on. So if you have smaller span of control, then you will have actually a very tall organizational hierarchy. And if you have a wide span of control, then you will have a flatter organizational structure, which may look like this. And for a tall organizational structures, there are more layers of management between the frontline employee and the top level, and a fewer employees or subordinates report to each manager. And to some extent, I guess you can say this is the advantage. So the supervisor or the manager have greater opportunity to supervise and monitor the employee's activity. On the contrary, the flatter organizational structure, which has a wider span of control, has fewer management layer. Manager manage larger number of employee by comparison, and this can lead to greater level of freedom for each employee because there's so many employees that managers need to manage. Eventually, they have to give them some degree of freedom. There are pros and cons for each approach, but the trend is actually moving from a traditional narrow span of control, taller organizational structure to a much flattened organizational structures. This is an example to show you kind of calculation. We certainly are making some assumption, like assume the span of control is the same for each managers. In this case, if we have at the front line about 4,000 frontline employee, and each manager manage about 4 employee, then you need to have the supervisor first, the frontline supervisor of the frontline employee, you need to have about 1,000, and then they have to have about 246 managers, and those managers need to have, once again, 64 managers managing them, and eventually that's the CEO or general manager on the top. If we double the span of control from 4 to 8, then you find out that we only need to have about 500 managers to manage the frontline worker, and those managers in return need 64 managers on top of them, and eventually a manager managing the 64, and finally we come down to the CEO to manage this top tier managements. There are 8 of them. I do believe there's no magic number in terms of what's the good number for span of control. It really depends on the organizational cultures and the type of industry they're in. But 8 seems to be a reasonable number to me. 8 to even 12 depends on the situation. So if you look at the organizational level, in this tall organizational structure, there's 7 levels, and in this flatter organizational structures, there's only 5 levels. The manager level is actually only 4, but including the frontline worker, then there's totally 5 layers. And the total number of managers only in this flattened organizational structure is only about 600. And in this very taut and smaller span of control situation, we have more than twice and close to actually 3 times more managers in this organizational structure on the left-hand side. So this kind of gives you a sense of how the span of control, the number for the span of control may impact the organization's levels. And you would probably realizing a lot of company managers often try to change and most likely to increase their span of control. The question is, what is the reason for managers who want to manage more employees? That seems to be unreasonable, because that could mean more work for them. But at the same time, when you manage more subordinate, which means that you probably are more important and powerful. I guess that's one reason behind the so-called larger span of control. And up to a certain point, for instance, if I have, let's say, 6 employees that I need to manage, I may ask to add more employee, and up to a point, I say I cannot do it anymore. So what do? You basically may change this to maybe have 3 groups, and you have group or team leaders manage the employee. So you become actually 1 level up on this. You add another layer of managers below you. That's how you can kind of increase your span of control, if you include everybody down below you as part of your span of control. Then you need to add layers in order to manage more employee. Okay, so The last key element is departmentalization, which is the basis by which jobs are grouped together. So how do you group different type of jobs? Assuming we know all the jobs that we need to create, but eventually we need to group them such that they can be managed and coordinated. There's two approaches. One is in terms of departmentalized an organization. One is functional structures. We group job based on business function. Okay, let me emphasize, it's in the textbook they may say group job based on function, but they're really referring to business function, not management function. Business functions such as marketing, HR, manufacturing, finance, accounting, etc. It can be grouped based on product line or service, customer segment, or geographic location. And this, for large organization, this is actually very typical. For instance, IBM has a division for storage, memory, mainframes, or consulting services, and they almost run as an independent unit. They're considered a strategic business unit, or sometimes just referred to as a division. Okay. And they usually have their own business functions department. They may have to do their own marketing, they may have to do some of their own financing, etc. So this is an example of the functional grouping called functional organization. And so this can be HR, this can be marketing, and this could be finance. And we have employee work under each of the functional area. And by the way, this came from a project management book of knowledge document, version 4 of it. Divisional organization, in this case, we're dividing the organization in terms of the product line. So product A, or sometimes it's a category of product. Product A or product category A has a division. Product category B has another division, and they may have their own R&D, manufacturing, accounting, finance, marketing, and customer service department. Certain department like HR may be centralized, so each division may not have an HR function. Procurement, in this case, seems to be centralized, and sometimes you may have some centralized procurement, but you may have some division has its own procurement department working with the headquarters procurement department. Legal department, usually it's at the administrative at headquarters level. This is an interesting diagram that I've seen from time to time. I managed to actually found a copy, and this is example of, I don't know how you're going to draw a diagram to represent the situation. We seems to have too many managers and only one frontline worker who are there digging holes. Okay, and I wonder whether you sometimes find yourself in a similar situation. And sometimes we do have a so-called matrix organization, which means that we have the traditional functional area grouping based on the business function. However, when situations arise, sometimes we need to form cross-functional area project team or project Then we will assign somebody from one functional area to be a project manager and managing staff who may be working on this project full-time or part-time. So to a certain extent, this is why that sometimes you may have more than one boss, because as a staff or employee here, you may need to report to the functional area managers, and also you may need to report it to the project manager that you work for a particular project. There's some advantage of this matrix structure. And once again, the matrix structure means the traditional functional structure plus the cross-functional areas, kind of a project team structures. And the matrix structure are created in response to uncertainty and dynamics of the environment, because a lot of time we do need to have a close working relationship of employee from different functional area to work on a specific important project. And the metric structure may increase communication and cooperation among departments, and it will also increase the frequency of informal and formal communication within the organization. It will provide quick responses to technical problem and customer demand. However, there are some disadvantages, like too many bosses, too managers per individual can result in confusion and in power struggles. And more effort is required to coordinate workflow. There's a potential for interpersonal conflict within team member as well as the leaders, because the team member may not know whose instruction to listen to, particularly when there's a conflict arise. Should I listen to my functional area boss or the project manager, who is also my boss? Okay, that's it. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.